Yeah. Man, wow, what a great Sunday. What a great Sunday. I'm glad that you came today to be a part of this. Man, I just believe the Holy Spirit's speaking to many different people in here. In fact, I normally sit in the center, and so I don't often see what's going on behind me. But when I'm sitting off to the side, what's really cool is when Pastor Daniela asked those who are being baptized to stand, I saw another 20 people up in this balcony over here who stood. So if you guys, I saw you, I know who you are, you need to come, and I'm just kidding. It was great because they stood, and then everybody went, and they sat back down real fast. Were there people up here too? I don't know. Did you guys see people up there? There were some? Okay, Phil says there were some up there, so I don't know who you are because I couldn't see you, but he saw them, and he will call you out. So he'll let me know afterwards. So, man, what a beautiful day. This is, without a doubt, the result of a tremendous amount of prayer, right? The prayers of friends and family, parents, grandparents that have resulted in this decision, this public act, this step of faith. And so such a cool thing to be a part of. Also for me to see the leadership that the Lord has brought to praise and seeing them kind of enacting that. That is, it's a result of prayer for our leadership and from our leadership as well. So just a cool thing to be a part of and see what God is doing. Just great to see fruit. And I just believe that I was, even as we were praying and just taking a moment to listen to the Holy Spirit, I just sense that there's something we're right on the edge of, here at Praise. And it's cool to see God doing a new thing here, and to be a part of that we get to be here during a time just like this. And for our kids to be raised in a time and a space and a place just like this. So good stuff. And I'm so excited to be a part of it. I know you are too. So today we're continuing just talking about what it is that God is calling us to as a church. And you'll see on your seats today these little cards that say, "We play for keeps." For those who've been here for a few years, you've seen a card like this before. We are right now just having finished phase 1 of the park, getting ready to start on phase 2 of the park. And we started talking about this last week, sharing the heart behind it. If you missed it, there is, and you missed the email. If you don't get an email from me on a weekly basis, you should check your spam or reach out to the church to see why you're not getting it. And we would love to make sure that you receive that. But this week, I sent out an email and just kind of shared that update. So there's a short video that you can see. If you're not a YouTube subscriber to Praise, you can be a YouTube subscriber. In fact, we're close to hitting 1,000 subs on YouTube, which is right up there with Dude Perfect and Mr. Beast. And so, but once we hit 1,000 subscribers, then we can start dropping links and stuff in there. So if you are not subscribed to Praise Assembly on YouTube, make sure to get out there and subscribe. Get us over that 1,000 mark, okay? That has nothing to do with nothing. But we have, I posted that video, which just kind of shares where we're at as we're moving to the next phase. It's really about the courts, pickleball courts, basketball court, sand volleyball court, creating space for our young adults, youth, kids, our community really, and all of our community to be able to come and participate here and create a center of the community here at Praise. I shared a little bit of my heart on that last week. Again, you can see some of that. If you go to the park's website, nepark.org, Northeast Community Park, nepark.org, you can find all of that there. You can also find it on all of our websites, Praise's websites. You can get it. You can find the link to that video in the message notes for this morning as well. So if you go to the message notes, you can grab that link to that video if you did not catch it. But in preparation for this next phase, we are looking to raise $100,000 by December 31st of this year. Now, what has worked for us in the past, and this is why we are leaning into this same method, was last time, 2022, the method that seemed to work was like a monthly commitment style. And just giving people an opportunity to prayerfully make a commitment through a certain time period. For us, this time, it's through December 31st of 2024. Last time we had commitments in the amount that we needed, so we were able to move forward. And then what was really cool is we saw exactly what was committed come in. So that's such an awesome thing, because often when people take up commitments or give commitments, often you expect a percentage of that to come in. Not at Praise. At Praise, when we commit to something, we do it. And that's such a cool thing to see. And so thank you so much for your faithfulness in giving in that way. Some people, even though we don't have a giving campaign active, it finished up in May of 2023. And some people have just continued to give monthly towards the park, which has enabled us to do some additional things that we didn't expect we were going to be able to do, which is all just very, very cool. And so thank you so much for all of those things. As we're making plans, our goal is to take these cards back up in 2 weeks on April 28th. April 28th is when we'll receive those cards back. For us as a family, we'll probably scan the little QR code that's on the card. So if you would take the card home with you, maybe you scan the QR code, you can make that commitment in an online fashion. So for us, we'll write ours in, mark monthly commitment, or you can mark one time, and just what that commitment would be. So the reason why we need to know what we're going to expect in 2024 is because just based on how it went last time, we just deeply believe that Praise follows through with our commitments. And so based on those commitments, we would just go ahead and move forward, start that process, because we want to have our grand opening in September of this year. And again, if you don't know what the heart is behind this, if you missed it last week or you haven't been a part of Praise long enough to really kind of hear that heart, there's another video that's going to drop this week in the email where I'll just kind of share with you what the heart is behind it, so you can kind of get a feel for the mission, vision, values of what we're trying to accomplish with the park. And so make sure to get on that email list. If you're not, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're not, make sure to follow along as we go through this process. This last week when I dropped that email, just sent it out to the church, I just asked, hey, so one of the things several years back, Mike Bisking approached me, one of our board members approached me and said, hey, Alan, one thing we probably should do first is plant a bunch of trees. Because you see, if we get the trees in the ground, then they'll start growing, and they'll be growing all while you're developing. And we just at the time just didn't have the funds to be able to set aside for that in phase 1 or even phase 2. And so in the email on Thursday that we sent out, I just said, hey, would anybody be willing, because we want to plant about 100 trees, $10,000, would anybody be willing to just take that and make that their project? And a wonderful couple here at Praise who wanted to be anonymous just said, you know what, we'll take that on. So within 30 minutes of having sent that email, somebody had reached out and said, hey, we'll cover those trees. Yeah, which is awesome. Super cool. So now we need to do a serve day at Praise and plant 100 trees. So that's coming up. Joe Sardo will get that on the calendar for you. Talk to him after service. He'll let you know when it is. No, not really. Just give us a little time to figure that out because getting 100 trees is going to be a process. But we want to get them in the ground as soon as possible so that they can be growing even as we are moving on other things. But very cool. It's very cool to see how people are in on this project, are participating. If you were one of those who have just been giving faithfully, even though there hasn't been a giving campaign going, I want to just ask you, even still, to fill this card out, just either monthly or one time. Just let us know so that when we total these up, April 28th, when we bring these back in, when we receive these back, based on what commitments have been made, we will make decisions on how we move forward with phase 2 and phase 3, conceivably. And so just as a part of that, if you would, just make sure to fill that out prayerfully. Again, for us, we'll probably scan it as a family, fill it out online so that we can keep this on our fridge and we can see what we're doing. I told the staff this week, and I mean it, that as the leader of Praise, I want to lead the way. And by leading the way, I mean leading the way in every way, including giving. And so and I talked to our staff about it, that I expect them to lead the way in giving as well. That if we are in leadership at Praise, that this is one of the ways that we lead. And so just know that this is something that from the top all the way through, we want to see be something that we are participating in together. So again, we'll receive those commitments back on April 28th. Based on how those commitments go, April 29th, we'll make a decision on how we are moving forward. For Liz and me, we are planning. Next year is our 20th anniversary. Yeah. Woo! That just speaks to Liz's long suffering and 20 years. And so we were planning on making a big trip, first trip as a family overseas, going to London. And as we've been saving for several years, as we were thinking about what is the order of priority here for us. And so we put that saving on hold in order to put money aside in order to participate in phase 2. Because again, we believe in it, and we want to see these things that God has kind of put in front of praise advance. And so just be praying about that together as a family. Talk about it together with your kids and see what that might look like for you. Okay? So take them home, pray over them, bring them back 2 weeks, April 28th. Fill it out online, fill out the card, whichever way you do it. But then we'll total those up and make some decisions on that. Okay? Awesome. All right, I got to talk for a brief period just on something tangentially related. So I've mentioned to you before that when Liz and I were dating way back, right? So we've been married for 20 years, but way back in the early 2000s, probably right around 2002 when we were dating, we put together a little plaque, which the idea behind the plaque was this. We put at the top of it, a chance to witness God's faithfulness. And on there, then, we put some things that we felt like God had put in front of us as a couple for our future. And so we prayerfully kind of did that and put some things on that plaque. And so for example, on there, it was get married at the right time is on that plaque. So this plaque sits down in my office at home. And so, like, I see it and Liz sees it. Nobody else sees it. But also on there was finish school at the right, or finish school, just as finish school. And that meant undergraduate, because both of us were in our undergraduate at that time. Also on that list was, it said start our ministry on there. And then it says, and this way back in 2002, didn't know how it was going to happen, but we said become lead pastors. That's on the plaque. I don't know that I've ever mentioned that. But it also says earn doctorate. And it's really cool to see now, 20 years on, how something that God had kind of put in our hearts at that time. So that was for me. That was a specific one for me, how God has brought that about. Well, there's one more on there that I've never really mentioned, and that was all those years ago, I said, write a book. Now, for those of you who've written a book, you'll be clear, I didn't say get a book published. That's a totally other thing, but I just said, write a book. And what's cool is, as I reflect on that and look forward to that, because that's something that I believe God has in front of me, that's like the last one on my list. So once I'm done with that, like I get to sit back and kick back for the rest of my life, which is awesome. No, God's already kind of been speaking about some new things to put on there, but as part of that, like, what's cool is how God prepares you for each thing, even as he is doing that thing. What I didn't know was how much writing is a part of the whole earning a doctorate thing, right? Like, somewhere along the line, I learned how to preach. Not saying I've learned how to do it well, but I learned how to. Now, in this process, I am learning how to write, and how God is using that in order to prepare me for something else that is yet ahead of me. It's a cool thing to watch. But I already know, as I've thought about this, what that first book would be about. And I'll tell you right now, when I get an opportunity to write it, it will be about a series that I did back in 2017 called Meant for Good. It was a series that, as I was doing the study associated with it, I thought, man, if I could just dwell in this and spend some time on it, it would be so good. It was the story of Joseph. And there are so many things that aren't talked about in Joseph's story, but there's such richness to it. And often we just kind of focus on the things that have always been focused on instead of stopping and reading the story from a fresh perspective. So first book I write will probably be along those lines, may even be called Meant for Good, I don't know, but it'll be on Joseph's story. Well, today I kind of want to read a part of that story that we often don't read, a part of the story that isn't a part of, like, when I was much younger, I don't know how, my mom fell in love with Donny Osmond. Is that his name? Donny Osborne? Osmond? I don't know, but Dude, I have almost all of the songs from Technicolor Dreamcoat song, almost all of those committed to memory somewhere in there. Like, I'm not saying it's a good thing, I'm just saying it's there. And so this story's always kind of been like they're fresh for me. But there's a part of it that never showed up in that amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat musical. And there's a reason why. And it's in Genesis chapter 47. So I would just kind of want to read that to you. I don't have a ton of time, but I want to read this. It's as Joseph, because if you don't know this about Joseph, he is the person that's talked the most about in Genesis, right? So most people think, what is Genesis about? Adam, Eve, Noah. I mean, these guys don't even crack the top 10 of people who are mentioned the most in the book of Genesis. Abraham gets 12 chapters, or is it 10 chapters? I think he might only get 10 chapters. No, he gets 12. Jacob gets 10. Joseph gets 13 chapters. He's talked about the most in the book of Genesis, and really there's this richness to his story. But as you get to Genesis chapter 47, this is really Joseph at the height of the pinnacle of his life and ministry. Everything's cruising. This is like everything. He's hitting on all cylinders, right? It doesn't get any better than this. Like, this is him at the height of his power. And the first part of it's about him moving his family. And I want to pick up in verse 13 because this is after they've been storing food for 7 years. So he tells Pharaoh, listen, there's going to be 7 years of just great returns, and then there's going to be, a big famine. And he said, now, if you were smart, what you would do is you would appoint somebody to kind of be your person to gather the food up during the times of plenty, right? And then it's really amazing because Pharaoh says to Joseph, he goes, man, is there anyone else in whom is the Spirit of God? Which is such an interesting phrase from somebody who is not a believer, right, in Yahweh. And yet he says clearly, the Spirit of God is in this guy. And then from there, Joseph does all of those things. So 7 years, collects it. And then you get into the famine, and he has the whole story with his brothers. And then this is what happens for the rest of Egypt during that time. So verse 13. And there's a reason why this isn't talked about a lot, because, I'll just read it. Verse 13. Meanwhile, the famine became so severe that all the food was used up, and the people were starving throughout the lands of Egypt and Canaan. By selling grain to the people, Joseph eventually collected all the money in Egypt and Canaan, and he put the money in Pharaoh's treasury. When the people of Egypt and Canaan ran out of money, all the Egyptians came to Joseph. Our money is gone, they cried, but please give us food or we will die before your very eyes. Now, it's probably hyperbole that Joseph collected all the money. But it's saying he had a lot of it, right? And it isn't just Joseph doing this. This is like him leading an entire administration, right? But he's at the top. He's the dude who's signing the checks or whatever. He's the guy who's making the final decisions, and there's probably a massive administration of actually making these things happen. Not everybody came to Joseph and asked for a certain amount of food. It was a whole system, I have no doubt, for it to have been like something that was sustainable and real, right? But he is an administrator, and he does it great. It's his wheelhouse. But more than that, thinking about the environment that he was in, I can guarantee you, as an administrator, the key administrator for an absolute monarch in Egypt, I guarantee you there were people who were taking shots at him behind his back. I guarantee you there were power-hungry sycophants that were to his face, like saying everything that they thought, and then on the backside, when they were talking to Pharaoh, were trying to undercut him. We know this because that's kind of what happens in every time that situation shows up, right? When it's Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel, they do that to him when he's the top guy in Babylon. And so probably that's also happening for Joseph. But Joseph, as he's walking through this in some way, it seems like none of those shots land. I mean, there's something about Joseph at this point in his life where it's like, it doesn't even mention them. Where it does for Daniel, it doesn't mention them for for Joseph. It doesn't say that Joseph was thrown into a lion's den, right? Like he somehow is able to operate at a very high level in the power of the day. And he's killing it. But more than that, when it says, in verse 14, we often will skip by it, it says, by selling grain to the people, Joseph eventually collected all the money in Egypt and Canaan. Like he's got a lot of money going through his hands. And we quickly kind of read by what he does with that. All this money is coming through his hands, and he put the money in Pharaoh's treasury. He didn't skim off the top. Like he didn't take 10%. He didn't have some contracts for his buddies. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like this is a person of integrity in a place where if he didn't have integrity, if all this money is coming through his hands, he could have taken a little bit off the top and made sure that made it into Joseph's treasury. You know what I'm saying? But that's not what it says. It says that he takes all of that money and puts it into the Pharaoh's treasury. And I remember back in 2017 when I first preached that series that there was one thing in particular that deeply struck me about the story of Joseph when he was in Potiphar's house and Potiphar's wife was after him, right? Like there's this moment where she's pursuing him because it says that he was beautiful, which is really interesting because it says he was so handsome. The word that's used for it is only used of men two other times in Scripture when it talks about David and when it talks about Absalom. They're the only two other men who are not just handsome, they are all the way to beautiful. This word is used often of women, right? It's used of Sarah. It's actually used of Joseph's mother, interestingly, Rachel. And so he gets his good looks from his mama, apparently, but he is beautiful. But to the point where apparently that was an issue for him. So it's like where beauty is a curse. Now, some of you don't know what this is like, so let me tell you that as... But for him, apparently, like it puts him in a rough spot. Some of you laughed way too hard at that. As I'm reflecting, like my brain's now stuck on, what do you have to laugh at? Come on now. Anyways, but it works out against him, and Potiphar's wife is pursuing him. And I remember reflecting on that moment when she pursues him to the point of he has to take off and he leaves his Technicolor coat behind. And it says that when he's talking to her, he says to her, he says, I have everything has been given to me. Potiphar has trusted me. How could I do this to him? And it actually says in Psalm 105 that moment was God actually testing Joseph. That God tested Joseph. And that word testing is something that I think a lot of times we don't understand. We think that God's just trying to figure something out about us. But the word is very specifically used of a purifying process, of a process of metal becoming a pure and strong metal. But that through that process, God was purifying and preparing Joseph. But I often get asked from people, is God testing me when they're in a low moment, when they're dealing with something hard, when they're going through a struggle, when they're at their low, when they're in the valley, and they'll stop and they'll ask me, I've been asked this plenty of times, do you think God is testing me? And what I almost always respond in those low moments is, I have no idea, maybe. I don't know. I'm not sure. I can't say with certainty whether God is testing you in this or not. But the amazing thing about Joseph's story is that testing was not Joseph's low moment. It was actually a blessing moment. Because he says in his own words, he says, listen, I've been given everything in my power. Everything has been put into my hands. And so if somebody comes to me and says in a low moment, am I being tested? I'll usually say, man, I don't know. But if somebody in a moment of blessing comes to me, which has never happened, and asks, am I being tested? Every single time I will say yes. Because we only think of testing as those low moments. But in Scripture, what I see is it is in blessing that God is most testing us, doing something in us. And what God did in Joseph in that moment when he was being pursued was he prepared him for the moment when all this money would be coming through Joseph's hands. And the question of, will you take what does not belong to you, was answered there. Because God did that in him then, so that when he's in the key spot and he is doing all of these things and there's all this money coming through his hands, and there are people who would love to see Joseph get knocked down a notch or two, that in that moment he was prepared for it. And the reason why is that blessing is always a testing. That the Lord will test us in our blessings. And for Joseph, his heart had been prepared that he would not take what does not belong to him. God had prepared him for that moment. And so, as a result, when all the money comes through his hands, he puts it all right into Pharaoh's treasury. I want to keep reading, though, because it's actually the next part that's so interesting to me. Verse 16, this is a chunk. Joseph replied, "Since your money is gone, bring me your livestock. I will give you food in exchange for your livestock." So they brought their livestock to Joseph in exchange for food, in exchange for their horses, flocks of sheep and goats, herds of cattle and donkeys. And Joseph provided them with food for another year. But that year ended. And the next year then they came back again and said, "We cannot hide the truth from you, my lord. Our money is gone, and all our livestock and cattle are yours. We have nothing left to give but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your very eyes? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We offer our land and ourselves as slaves for Pharaoh. Just give us grain so we may live and not die, so the land does not become empty and desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sold him their fields because the famine was so severe, and soon all the land belonged to Pharaoh. As for the people, he made them all slaves from one end of Egypt to the other. The only land he did not buy was the land belonging to the priest. They received an allotment of food directly from Pharaoh, so they didn't need to sell their land. Well, now that you guys are inspired, let's just release you into... No, I mean, like, this is a story that's often not read, partly because, man, it's like the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. And why didn't Joseph just give them the food for free? And so some people, like, really struggle with this. But this is like a path or a thing that is happening in Joseph's life where people are like, man, this doesn't seem like the Bible, right? Like, I mean, this is late stage capitalism, right? I do not hate on billionaires who made more money during the pandemic, because they were prepared for a moment and they risked for that moment, and then as a result of it, they made money. I don't have a problem with that. That is just the principle of sowing and reaping. Period. And so if people get after that and go attack on it, man, just you do whatever you want to do. But what I see in Scripture is when you sow, you reap. That when you put your money into something and you risk it and things turn out, then you will reap as a result of it. And that's exactly what this passage is really about. God enabled this moment to happen. And I do think there's something really interesting happening here where, remember, Joseph had gotten sold into slavery in Egypt, and now he sells all of Egypt into slavery. Isn't that a remarkable reversal? But now, the slavery here is probably like an indentured servitude and whatever. We don't really know. But in this moment, this is a result of the fact that when everybody else is burning through everything they got, well, Pharaoh, taking Joseph at his word and the dreams and what God had spoken, takes advantage and begins to store it up. And now, as a result of having that prepared, he is able to reap the benefit of it. This is just sowing and reaping. Joseph is being a good steward here, and the opportunity for abuse, though, obviously is huge in this moment. What will they do with this? Because now they've got the entire, and it doesn't even say, by the way, it says in other passages that this isn't just in Egypt. This is the whole world that ends up coming to Egypt in order to get food out of this moment. So there's a ton of stuff that's happening right in this moment. But Joseph is acting as a steward of it, and he is reaping what he has sowed. But what will he do next? Right? He's operating with integrity, which wouldn't it be nice if politicians did that? But he's operating with integrity, but he is also reaping what he has sowed. But what does he do next? And that's the verse 23 I want to get to. Then Joseph said to the people, "Look, today I've bought you and your land for Pharaoh. I will provide you with seed so you can plant the fields. Then when you harvest it, 1/5 of your crop will belong to Pharaoh. You may keep the remaining 4/5 as seed for your fields and as food for you, your households, and your little ones." "You have saved our lives," they exclaimed. "May it please you, my lord, to let us be Pharaoh's servants." Joseph then issued a decree still in effect in the land of Egypt that Pharaoh should receive 1/5 of all the crops grown on his land. Only the land belonging to the priests was not given to Pharaoh. So Joseph, when he has the opportunity to do whatever he wants, says, "I want 1/5 for Pharaoh. I will give you the seed to sow into the ground, but then Pharaoh gets 1/5 from now on." Wait a second. He could have taken 4/5. He could have taken 95% and left them just enough to survive. Now, I don't know if you know this, but most likely you pay more than 20% in taxes. I do. When you add together income tax and property tax and personal property tax, and did you know that because I drive an electric vehicle, every year I have to go down to the DMV and give them a check for what I should have paid in gas tax? You drive a gas vehicle, you pay the tax when you go to the pump and you pump gas. Well, because I drive an electric vehicle, they say, well, you still need to pay your gas tax. So I get a little piece of sticker that I'm supposed to put on my window, and I don't do it. Because you will not make me put that sticker on my car, but I do pay the tax because I'm required to. And when you add it all up, it is far more than 20%. But Joseph in this moment takes 20%. And you look at it and you go, oh, how generous of Joseph. And to some degree, it probably is. But also, what if he would have taken 95%? What would have happened in Egypt? I guarantee you, it might have lasted for a year or two, but the Egyptians would not have been happy with that long term. And it would have turned ugly. But in this moment, when they have the opportunity to just take it all for a brief period of time, he decides instead, I'm not going to take it all, I'm just going to take 20% for a long period of time. Joseph is playing the long game. He sets it up to be a sustainable thing moving forward from now on. It's genius. You get 4/5. You get this, we'll give you the seed, you can use the land, but when you reap it, we just want 20% back into perpetuity. It's genius, it's brilliant, and they won't rebel over 20%. They would rebel over 80% if they had tried to take 80 and give them 20%. I guarantee it. It wouldn't have lasted long. But they are playing the long game. And here is what I get from this story. That even as Joseph was reaping what he had sowed, he was also still sowing. We are always sowing seed. We are always sowing seed. See, sometimes we think we're in the process of reaping, and that may be true, but even as you are reaping, you are still sowing. Every moment. Galatians is clear about this. A man reaps what he sows. God cannot be mocked. What you sow, you will reap. There is a whole process. And I'm not saying this on our behalf individually to say, hey, sow into the park. What I'm saying instead is that what we are doing with the park is both a reaping and it is a sowing. Because right now, I get to reap from all the decisions made by the pastors who preceded me. Right? To be in the position that we are in, you are sitting in a church that most of us did not pay to help build. We didn't, right? So we are reaping from Albert Pyle and Robert Smith and Billy Burris and Kenneth Fent and their ministries. We are reaping and benefiting from those decisions which have gone long before in some instances. But we are also always sowing. And what I'm asking us to do is, as we're sowing and building a park, is to play the long game. Because the thing about this moment for Joseph is, it seems generous for him to just ask for 20%. But as the people prosper, as Egypt prospers, so also Pharaoh and Joseph and his people would prosper. Do you get that? And it's the exact same for us. As we sow into our community, I don't know exactly how it's going to happen, but I guarantee you it will. That as the good of the community, this is what Jeremiah said, as you see good in your community, you also will end up benefiting from it. Right? So Joseph in this moment is reaping from those decisions which had come long before, but he is also sowing for far into the future. And I love that we have this conversation on a morning where we did baptisms. Because this is a reaping. It's a reaping for sowing from parents and grandparents and friends. But this moment is also a sowing. It is a sowing for lives that are going to be changed from now on. And the decisions which will come out of this will have far-reaching impact. And not just for them, but for them and their kids and their grandkids, that it will continue on. Every reaping is also a sowing. Every moment we are always sowing seed. We are reaping from others' decisions. We are reaping as a result of things that have been sowed into our lives. But no matter what is happening right now, while we may be reaping from others' decisions, we are also sowing for the future. So wherever we are in that process, at the top, at the bottom, in a moment of testing, not of testing, I don't know. Regardless, whatever we do in that moment will always be a sowing for the future. And I'm here for it. I want to play the long game. When we were first considering the whole park thing, this is a great example. Wasn't planning on sharing it, but it's a great example. I was concerned, thinking about the long game. Here's why. As a pastor of praise, let's say we start something. Let's say we build a park. And then, for whatever reason, I'm no longer the pastor of praise. I'm like, what am I saddling the next pastor of praise with? So, I found a different church that did this down in Florida. I haven't told anybody, maybe I did tell you this, I don't remember. And I called the pastor. And the pastor said, let me get you in touch with the former pastor, because he's the one who built it. And I said, okay. So I got in touch with the former pastor. And I asked him, I asked him lots of questions. I said, well, good, bad, ugly, all the things. And then I asked, and how did this impact when you left the church, when you stepped away and somebody else stepped in? And I said, how did that impact the whole search? How did that impact the next pastor and their vision and how they take things? And he said, the most amazing thing about it was that how beneficial it actually was in that next search. He said, because, number one, it very clearly communicated to every pastor who applied what this church is about. We are about our community. He said that was the first thing. And number two, it was also limiting for the type of pastors who would apply. Because you get pastors who apply who are also very much about our community. And so then, when God brought those two things together, it was a beautiful thing. And it actually flourished more after the next pastor came in. Play the long game. There are so many benefits from very clearly putting our heart on display to the whole community. And that's why we're doing what we're doing. And for you and for me, in a moment like this, we are reaping harvest from previous years' sowing, but we are also sowing for future harvests. In every moment, we are always sowing. Always.